Everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar today on the basics of incident response. We're very excited about this webinar. Housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is on the basics of incident response today. We are going to have a recorded version of the webinar available for download on our website, and everyone who attends the webinar today will also receive a copy in their email. We'll also be sending you the slides as well. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question box. We'll have time at the end where we'll be answering all questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks everybody for attending this webinar today about incident response. We're going to be talking about what constitutes an incident response program, what that incident response process looks like, and kind of what the key aspects of incident response are that you need to keep in mind when the worst happens. So a little bit about myself. I'm Paul. I'm one of the co-founders and chief security architect of TruShield. I have about 17 years of experience in information security across a pretty broad range of disciplines, including some incident response stuff. I'm also pretty active on social media, both on Twitter and LinkedIn, so I would encourage any attendee that if you have questions about what we talk about today or just security in general, feel free to reach out to me. My email address, my LinkedIn profile, and my Twitter are right there for you. And I definitely respond to questions and feedback. So please send any messages that you might have. A little about TruShield. So we are a global cybersecurity company that's based in Washington, D.C. We do have a footprint across multiple continents, including Africa, Middle East, and Asia, as well as our U.S.-based clientele. Our services include your typical professional services that you might find at most security companies, like penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. And additionally, our managed security services division provides 24/7 security monitoring and alerting to our clients, and that's really where our incident response practice comes in. By virtue of the fact that we're monitoring client networks for threat traffic, we see compromises and incidents occurring on client networks, and it's really a requirement of the way that we do business to be able to respond quickly to incidents when they occur. And that's, I think, the core message to deliver today, is that incident response really requires timely action, and that timely action is really based upon how well prepared you are. So those are some key topics that we're going to be talking about as we move forward. So the agenda for today, really, what is incident response? We're going to drill into it a little bit and what it really means, why it's important to the overall process and information security as a universe or a discipline in and of itself, what the process actually looks like, what steps are involved, what's important to keep in mind during each of those steps, and then really what is the closed loop cycle, what does that look like with respect to lessons learned? Super important to always be thinking about how can we improve this process, and not just across incident response, but security in general. And then lastly, of course, we're going to talk to you about how MSSP like TruShield could help with incident response. So with that said, so what is incident response? What does it involve? Why does it really matter? Incident response is kind of a relatively broad term, but it's really talking about receiving and reviewing security incident reports and activities, usually going to be involving a computer security incident response team. And the key aspect of this is being able to actually detect the incident when it occurs and deploy resources to actually do the response for it. A formalized incident response team, its main job function is incident response. It doesn't do analysis or vulnerability scanning or anything like that. It's basically poised and ready to respond to incidents when they occur, which is really why the vast majority of companies and individual entities don't have a standalone incident response team, because effectively what we're talking about is a group of highly seasoned and technical individuals that are almost on a bench waiting for the worst to happen. So what we see most often with organizations that we support is kind of a dual hat or multiple role sort of individuals where people fit into the incident response team in a kind of a part-time basis or an as-needed basis. That's not really the approach of a managed security services provider like us, where we've got resources specifically for this sort of thing, waiting for the worst to happen. But that's really it. Incident management is being able to detect an incident that's occurred on your organization's network and quickly deploy resources to contain and eradicate the problem. It's really important to be able to do that because, as we all know, it's impossible to be perfect, right? There's no way that anyone's security program can stop every single attack from being successful. Our security philosophy is that a good and mature security program is really comprised of four main components. And those components or capabilities are what you see on the screen there. They're prevention, detection, containment, and eradication. And incident response is really important because it makes up 50% of that puzzle. Without it, we're missing a key aspect of the security program as a whole. You can still focus on prevention and detection, of course, but as we know, you're simply not going to be able to stop all incidents. And so without having a really sound incident response plan and a process of how you actually take action when the worst does happen, you're going to wind up in a headline. And really, the key differentiator between the organizations that experience massive data breaches and those that simply have, perhaps a minor malware outbreak on one machine or a couple of machines is really how quickly they can contain and eradicate that incident. And operating under the assumption that you're going to be perfect with respect to prevention is a flawed model, and it certainly is going to leave you in a bad situation when the actual worst does happen. So please make sure as you're planning out your security programs, you've appropriated adequate resources to think about incident response, that you have a sound incident response policy, a good incident response plan, that you've tested. It's really important to test incident response plans because a lot of times what you're going to find, even through a tabletop test where various different stakeholders in the organization get together and just talk through it, even just doing that, you're going to find gaps that you really didn't think about when you're writing that plan in the first place. And there's no way that you're going to be able to do a good job of incident response without that kind of practice. It's like any sort of talent or discipline, practice makes perfect, and the more that you practice your incident response plan, the better off you're going to be when it actually does happen. And unfortunately, it's a when, not an if. So what does the incident response process look like? It's a 7-step process, and each of them are really important, but I'm going to zero in on a couple specifically as I would consider them to be among the most important. So this is what the 7-step process looks like. We've got preparation, or the stuff that you're going to do in advance to make sure that you can actually achieve the goal of incident response. Identification, or the act of being able to actually detect the incident and identify whether or not it is a legitimate security incident or perhaps a false positive. And then containment, being able to put a wrapper around that specific compromise or whatever that incident is so that it doesn't expand in scope and cause the response process to grow. Because as incident response grows, costs they grow exponentially. Incident response is one of the costliest areas of information security, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Again, mostly because the incident response companies that have that bench staff need to basically keep those guys on the bench, and it results in extremely high bill rates for the kind of drop everything response activities when something like a data compromise does happen. I'm sure you've seen some of the bill rates that get charged for on-demand incident response. It's extremely high. So the better you can do at containment, the easier it's going to be to do the investigation, eradication, and recovery. And investigation is really the whole discipline around root cause analysis. What actually happened that caused this incident to occur? And not only that, what was the actual scope of the incident? Did we leak data? Does somebody still have a footprint in our environment? That sort of stuff is where that investigation process happens. Eradication is making sure that there are no lingering tendrils of the bad guys still on your network anywhere, that any footprint that they've been able to establish or any territory that they've been able to claim within your environment, you've taken that back from them. You've removed every piece of malware that they've dropped into the environment, and all that sort of stuff is taken care of so that you know you're at a known good and healthy state. And recovery is then making sure that your operations are still functional, that you're able to restore to full capacity any services that have been degraded as a result of the incident, and also any systems that had to be rebuilt or reimaged or anything like that, they've been recovered and are back to full operational capability. And then lastly, of course, is that lessons learned where we kind of look backwards at what we just went through and think about how can we do this better next time. So again, each of these are important in and of themselves, and it really is truly a situation where we're only as good as our weakest link. So you certainly do have to have a lot of thought put towards each of these components, but I'm going to give you some guidance on how to go about doing that. And we'll start with preparation. In my opinion, preparation is, it's one of those things that time and effort spent in the preparation phase makes the rest of the process that much easier. It's truly a situation where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and being prepared for an incident is going to help you minimize response costs and make sure you're not running around with your hair on fire when this sort of thing does happen. And there are a couple things that you can do to make sure that you're prepared for the worst. First off, there are things like the security policies that are going to have to be in place to ensure that people know what sort of activities are appropriate on a network and what are not, what's acceptable activity for your employees to have within your environment. Very important that that's not only written down someplace, but that your employees have seen that and they've things like signed a rules of behavior agreement, stuff like that's important because that sets the stage for the mindset of the employee. And a lot of times the incidents that you're going to find occurring in your network are the result of employees taking bad actions or not really thinking through the risk of the stuff that they're doing. Additionally, the training and practice. Again, I'm going to harp on practicing the incident response plan. Preparation is about practice, and having a good incident response plan and having it written and the policies that support it is very important, but if we're not practicing it, we're not training people on how to take the activities that are assigned to them as a result of the incident response plan, we're going to be left holding the bag when it actually does happen. The identification of the incident, of course, is absolutely critical, because if you can't identify that an incident has occurred, then there's nothing to respond to. So being able to have the detective controls in place to identify when somebody has been able to drop payload of some malware in your environment, let's say ransomware, being able to detect that that's happened is absolutely critical. And unfortunately, that's an area that the majority of the industry has been really far behind on. You may have good firewalls, you may have an IDS or some other controls that provide some detective capability, but if you're not bringing them together in a SIM, if you're not utilizing a 24/7 managed service, then you're probably going to be missing some percentage of the security incidents that are actually happening in your environment. It takes 210 days on average to detect a security incident, and bringing that number down is going to reduce your incident response costs. So you want to try to do that as quickly as possible, because then as soon as you can detect an incident, you can move into containment, which again is going to make the rest of the response process that much easier. And then, of course, recovery, right? So we know that we're going to at some point have to restore operations to their full capacity. So things like having a good disaster recovery plan or business continuity of operations plan, those are extremely important, because that's how you're going to be able to make sure you get back up to full strength after the incident occurred, after you've identified it, and after you've eradicated whatever footprint that the bad guys have been able to gain in your environment. So having a good and well-established business continuity plan is also very important. All kind of falls into that preparation or pre-planning sort of stuff. And then pre-deploying assets, in that case, what I'm talking about there is some of the business continuity stuff with respect to like a hot failover capability, or having a disaster recovery site that's capable of picking up operations very, very quickly, which really is a huge advantage from a response and recovery standpoint. If you've identified a security incident and you can remove the risk or drastically reduce the risk simply by failing over to a PR site that isn't impacted by that security incident, then that gives you a whole opportunity to fail over operations. There's transparent to your user base. They're not going to feel any major pain from it while you go and clean up the actual incident that's occurred in the primary computing facility. So it's really important to have those capabilities already in place. There are some other things to think about also when you're thinking about security policies. You want to think about things like warning banners when your employees log in. They should be greeted with a splash page that says, something like they waive the right to privacy, you have the ability to monitor them, and give at least some of the information about what their rules of behavior are in terms of what they can and can't do. Of course, you need to have that incident notification process, which is part of the incident response plan. That's where the correct stakeholders throughout the organization are brought together in an incident response sort of engagement, where people that need to know or that have some ability to impact the incident response process are looped in. And the way that we usually do that is with a notification process is by obviously escalating up in responsibility and authority the longer an incident goes on. But additionally, from a communication and coordination standpoint, we set the stage where if there's ever a security incident, basically we open a conference bridge with all of the stakeholders involved in that particular incident and just have an open line of communication throughout the entire response process. So if somebody has an update, they can simply dial back into the bridge and update everybody at the same time. Having that sort of stuff ready is part of preparation and is how you're going to be able to very quickly be able to respond to incidents when this actually does happen. Of course, you need to have the correct monitoring, the correct probes, the correct sensors throughout your environment to be able to pick up incidents. and that's also part of the preparation phase. So as you look at your security program and your security tool ecosystem, if you don't have really good detective controls out there with sensors in the right places and the ability to match them against threat traffic and do that on a continuous basis, you're going to have a hard time detecting sophisticated threats that will result in security incidents that you're going to have to deploy major resources to be able to actually stop. So that's all about identification, right? So identification is really the ability to say, is this a legitimate security incident or not? And if it is a legitimate security incident, what really are we looking at here? So the way that we do that, there's a number of different facets that we look at in terms of the identification and detection of a security incident. First off, the way that we recommend that you structure your security control environment is to look at both signature-based threat traffic, so things like antivirus signatures or malware signatures that could be coming from your firewalls or your antivirus tools or your intrusion detection systems. Those signature-based things are going to be very quick, and they'll pick up the vast majority of stuff that is known threat traffic. What they do not pick up is the stuff that is unknown, the stuff that we call zero-day, that there isn't a signature written for yet, or the stuff that simply leverages intelligent algorithms that are things like polymorphic code that might change 1 bit or 1 byte each time the program is executed, so that there's a way to evade the signature detection methodology. So in those sorts of cases, what you really need is behavior-based identification and being able to say this is normal behavior for this environment or it's not. And if it's not, that should warrant an investigation of your security operation team, and that investigation should really be this assess the situation phase. Is this an actual security incident? You need to explore those affected systems that you see those suspicious entries in and try to understand what's actually going on there. Do things like looking at system logs, look at security logs, look at traffic that's streaming to or from that device. Look for things like new user accounts, and we see that very frequently. One of the things that the attackers almost always do when they gain that initial foothold is they try to maintain that foothold, right? And that's going to be that persistence of access. A lot of times what they're going to do there is create a new user account within either your Active Directory or perhaps on a local system itself. And if you're not monitoring for that sort of thing, which I have to say the vast majority of organizations don't monitor for that, you're going to miss that attempt at maintaining persistent access. So you need to definitely be watching for that stuff. And if you see unexplained new user accounts, that should be an indicator that you certainly need to look for or look further into. The other one there, unexpected new files, that's also an extremely important one because the majority of sophisticated malware, the way it works is it's going to drop what's called a downloader or sometimes an exploit kit that is basically just programmed to pull different functionality down from the attacker's command and control node. And all of that new functionality is going to manifest itself in your systems by virtue of these unexplained files that are not really recognized. And they may exist in like application directories or in user directories. And it may be hard for you to detect that sort of thing if you're not looking at configuration management sort of tools that do integrity checks against system files and things like that, looking specifically for new files or new registry keys and things along those lines. Important to be able to put the big picture together using all of that different information, because that's really how you're going to be able to determine whether or not what you're looking at is a false positive or an actual incident. If it is an actual incident, there are a number of categories that should be assigned to what it is that's been observed. This is tied back to some National Institutes of Standards and Technologies frameworks and NIST. The NIST 861 document is the National Institutes of Standards and Technologies guide for incident response, and I would recommend anybody that's interested in incident response should take a look at that. It provides a very good framework for how incident response should work. It's definitely tailored for a government user, but the language that's used there and the intent and the process are all something that can be tailored to your specific environment so that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. But regardless, so the categories of incidents are unauthorized access, denial of service, malicious code, improper usage, scans, probes, and attempted access, and then a further investigation required. So each of those constitutes a different level of risk to your environment, and you should be able to, by virtue of the identification process, be able to say, what I've observed here looks to me like a malicious code instance, or it looks to me like this is somebody has gained some unauthorized access to a device. Might not be an outsider, might be an employee that's gained unauthorized access to perhaps a payroll database. That's a security incident. And in cases where you aren't exactly certain what exact category the incident is that you're looking at, then that's where that level 6 comes in, where there's additional investigation required. But one way or another, you're going to want to evaluate which one the incident falls under, because that's going to inform how you move forward with containment and eradication. And so with that, we're going to move on to containment. So containment, first off, is the process of trying to wrap your hands around an incident and make sure that it doesn't balloon. The better you do at containment, the easier the rest of the job is going to be, because fixing one device is a lot easier than fixing 100 devices. And I personally have seen this manifest in the worst case scenario, where an organization that we supported didn't take timely containment action, and there are many things that fall under the description of containment action, but they didn't take it, and as a result, a single phishing attack, like a single phishing email a person clicked on, resulted in over 5,000 compromised devices that had to all be reimaged, and that cost that organization millions of dollars because they didn't act swiftly enough with respect to containment. So containment, first off, we need to determine the operational status of the environment and understand, are we still at full operating capacity, or do we need to start disconnecting and shutting down devices in order to protect ourselves? And if there are any critical resources or critical processes that are affected, how do we keep those alive while we're doing the process of containment eradication? There are a number of things that can be done from a containment standpoint and some general guidance with respect to that. Containment a lot of times boils down to timely communications and being able to say, we, the security operations team, have identified this incident. There's perhaps an ongoing phishing campaign that's affecting our user base. This is the type of email you may see. That's a containment action that you're attempting to ensure that that particular attack doesn't balloon out or expand from that single instance of successful compromise. Other things that fall under the containment category are things that actually should be built into your network and built into your security ecosystem and the security program as a whole. Largely, when somebody asks me what's the most effective containment mechanism, I usually say network architecture, because the way that your network is architected can either support containment or it can just fly right in the face of it. An internal network that's very well segmented between things like your DMZ and public-facing assets and your internal server core and then your user environment. Good segregation between those different security contexts really helps with the containment aspect, because what happens the majority of the time nowadays with respect to threat traffic is they're going to be focused on trying to compromise the endpoint that the user's sitting at. And so if you can put some network segmentation around that space that's high risk, with people that are the assets that are attempting to use the internet, which is a high-risk environment, if you can put some segmentation around there, the effect of a single instance of perhaps a malware download should only be able to affect other devices in that same network segment. And what that means is that that compromise is going to be much less likely to fan out to like your server core where your actual sensitive information is stored. And so that's how you stop a malware download from turning into a massive data breach. Good network segmentation. It's very, very important. And as you look at your security programs and your network architecture as a whole, you should really be thinking, does this network architecture support containment? And if not, you should be making plans to re-architect that either through VLANing or perhaps through physical segmentation if you're a very high security or high sensitivity environment. But there are, with respect to containment itself, so we have 3 potential activities up there that can happen after you determine the operational status. It's disconnect, shutdown, and monitor. So disconnect, right? So disconnect means I'm going to take this particular asset off the network. And that also ties back into the network segmentation thing I was just talking about. So if you have very good network segmentation, you've identified a critical incident on perhaps, again, a user network, you can simply disconnect that segment of the network from being able to even talk to the critical sensitive database that has your client information or something along those lines. Additionally, if you have very good containment strategies in place, you can do things like port security and block a device at the switch level so that when you identify a particular incident on one device, you can block that single device very granularly from the network operations center rather than having to physically go to that device and unplug it from the network. Of course, if there's actually identified security incident with malware or with unauthorized access or something like that, you need to shut that device down. That's very important to do quickly, because the longer that device is online, the more likely things are going to happen like log deletion, which is going to make it very hard for the incident response team to actually do root cause analysis. Additionally, the longer a device is left online, the more likely it is that the attacker is going to be able to pivot to at least other machines on that same local subnet. Very important that you're able to do that also as quickly as possible. The other thing, of course, is monitoring. So if you know that there's a security incident that's occurred on a particular segment of your network, then that should be a trigger for very granular monitoring of other devices on that same network segment, or any other device in your environment that could be exposed to risk by virtue of that incident on that single device. So it's important to be able to do that. And what, again, that ties back to is the preparation phase of being able to have the correct security controls in place to do the monitoring of when this sort of thing does happen. Very important to be able to do that, because all of that's actually going to support the investigation phase, right? Being able to do that monitoring is where you're going to be able to draw in logs and put together a picture of what just happened. And so the investigation phase really is talking about a methodical, systematic review of the information that's available to piece together the big picture of what just happened in an attempt to answer a number of questions. The questions that we're trying to answer are: what was the scope of this incident? What data was accessed? Who did it? How did they do it? What can we learn from reviewing these logs? Those are questions that should be very important and top of mind when you're working through this sort of thing, because those sorts of questions, the better you're able to answer them, the more quickly you're going to be able to eradicate any incidents or indicators that are still in your environment. And additionally, the questions that you're not able to answer really well, those indicate gaps in your incident response plan, and also gaps in your security tool coverage that should flow into that lessons learned phase that we're going to talk about in a little while here. So the types of information that you should be drawing together to support your investigation include bitstream copies of the hard drives. That's really important because the hard drives themselves, especially if you're going to move into any sort of prosecutorial sort of next steps, you need to have a forensically viable copy of that hard drive. Otherwise, you don't have evidence, you have information. And if you're trying to, again, put some sort of prosecution together, or even thinking that might be an option, you need to have forensically viable evidence. And you can do that by creating those bitstream copies of drives. We also need to be very mindful of following things like chain of custody of evidence. And if all of this sounds foreign to you, these are very niche incident response sort of concepts that a seasoned incident response team should be able to do for you. Internally, in your own organization, if you're trying to put this together in kind of an ad hoc incident response team, make sure you read that NIST 861 document, because that's going to explain a lot of the stuff I'm talking about here. Also, you need to make those same sort of forensically viable copies of any external storage, also memory. There are a lot of malware strains that exist in memory and are resident in memory, and a lot of the indicators that you can play back to look at specific steps an attacker may have taken will still reside in memory. The caveat to that is, and this is the same holds true for hard drives, the longer the device is kept turned on after the incident, the less likely it's going to be to find any indicators in memory or in storage, because that stuff is just going to get overwritten by virtue of the system continuing to function. So that containment aspect of shutting down a compromised or affected device while you're doing the investigation is a critical piece. So additionally, network device logs. That's going to be super important as well, because a lot of times what you'll find is the indicators that are going to be most obvious or most prevalent are the traffic flows that are coming into and out of the environment. We see this all the time in our managed security services space, where an indicator shows up in our SIM that says, client X has had communication with this IP address in China that is known to host malware. That's an indicator right there that warrants further investigation. And being able to do that has definitely saved our clients from huge data breach potential. So if you're not doing adequate network device logging and including that in your SIM platform and mashing that against threat traffic for being able to identify geolocated or reputation-based IP addresses that have a history of hosting malware and stuff like that, you're going to be left with limited information and limited ability to detect indicators and also do that investigation after the fact. Application logs obviously are very important as well because things like your web applications, they're a lot of times going to be a vulnerable point that the bad guys will try to exploit by doing things like code injections or SQL injections and stuff like that. Your application logs should show you that. And so if you're sucking that stuff into your SIM, into your managed security services platform, and doing adequate analysis of that stuff, you'll be able to play back an incident and figure out what that root cause was. Because that's really what we're driving towards here, is what is the root cause of this so that we can fix it, so that this doesn't happen again. There's other supporting data that might be involved in that as well, and a lot of that really for us boils down to historical context. What has happened in this environment in the past? The past in these cases is oftentimes a pretty good indicator of what you can expect going forward, especially knowing what the follow-on actions were to a previous incident. So you can generally guess whether or not you're going to be likely to have a situation recur or not based upon how well you responded and what lessons you took from the last time something like this happened. Additionally, other supporting data could include where you sit within your own industry market, how high value a target you are. That's also going to help inform the investigation process, because what that will help you distinguish is whether or not you're a target of opportunity or a very specific target of something like an advanced persistent threat that's from a state-sponsored organization that may be doing espionage. If you're a very high-value target, it's almost certain that there's some APT that's looking at you. If you're not, perhaps you're a mid-sized company or mid-market within your particular industry, you may simply just be an opportunity or a target of opportunity, which means that some person out on the internet has fired off an automated tool against a very wide IP range and just happened to land on you. And unfortunately, they sunk your battleship. And that's how that actually happens quite a few times, or a significant percentage of the time is target of opportunity. You're simply just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But one way or another, you need to be able to answer those questions. Who did it? How did they do it? Why did they do it? And how can we stop it from happening again? And stopping it from happening again starts with this eradication component. First off, we need to clean up the actual exploit that occurred or the security incident that occurred. A lot of times that is going to involve running antivirus or anti-malware software. The unfortunate part about that is that there's a lot of times the malware or things like botnets exist below the operating system in terms of how the computing structure is set up. And so the antivirus system basically is not going to be able to pick up everything. In fact, Symantec themselves, they say that antivirus is only going to be effective, I think it's 45% of the time, which leaves 55% of the time you've got to do something else. That something else in a lot of cases is rebuilding or replacing the hard drive. Oftentimes, I simply just recommend moving to reimaging because it's going to be the quickest way. Now, what that requires is that you've got things like good gold images or configuration baselines that you can quickly redeploy, and also it requires that you've got some sort of offline storage or off-device storage, something like a centrally managed storage area network where your users keep their data, makes it so it's really easy to reimage an affected machine when it does happen. And the quicker you can do that, the better or more able you're going to be to recover to full operational status, which is the next step that we're going to talk about. Additionally, another aspect of eradication is actually notification. And this could be notification internally to your own organization. Certainly needs to include that component of it. Any stakeholder that's involved, certainly the leadership team, if there's been an actual security incident, needs to know. They need to know how it could affect their processes, how it could affect their users, how it can affect the clients of the company. And then those clients, if they are affected, also need to be notified. And certain industries actually have legal requirements to notify clients when their data has been compromised. Certainly any financial organization or organization that deals with PCI compliance or FISMA compliance or HIPAA compliance or anything like that, you're going to have to be able to notify affected parties of any security incident. And that can actually be a really challenging thing to do because what it requires is that you know who was impacted. And so what that really says is that we have to have done a good job in preparation, a good job in containment, and a very good job in identification so that we can say this subset of our population was affected by this incident, and this is the group that needs to be notified. And that, again, can be a challenging thing to do. Additionally, notification can often be extremely costly in and of itself because it can require outreach to client base, and part of that may also include things like credit monitoring. If you've exposed some personally identifiable information of your client base, it can be a really costly thing. And a lot of times, cyber liability breach insurance covers notifications. So make sure you take a look at your cyber liability breach insurance policy to whether or not it covers client notifications in the event of an incident. If it doesn't, you might want to look at getting a rider added to it to cover that. And also you want to make sure that it includes both voluntary and mandatory notifications. Because there may be mandatory notifications that are required by law, but there may be sometimes where your organization wants to do voluntary notifications, and a lot of the policies I've seen don't pay out for voluntary notifications. So just something to be mindful of as you're looking at cyber liability breach insurance. But again, all that is in support of recovery, right? The idea here is that we need to get back to full operational capacity. We need to restore service so that our company can keep functioning, so that we can keep accomplishing our mission, and hopefully without impact from this particular security incident. And if the security team's done their job and has, a good security program put together that can, contain and eradicate, then hopefully there hasn't been too much of an impact. But if there has, that restoration really needs to begin by focusing on what are the most critical aspects of the system that have been affected by an incident, and then focusing the recovery effort on those most critical assets or critical processes first. Get the business critical stuff back up and operational as quickly as possible and as safely as possible, and then focus on the overall less criticality to the overall environment. Now, the question that begs, and what that probably has you thinking is, how do I know? Or perhaps you haven't done a very good job of asset classification or process identification, or things like what's called a business impact analysis. That really is where you're going to define what your most critical assets are, what your most critical processes are, who your most critical people are, and what your most critical information is. If you can answer all of those questions, then the recovery process after an incident has occurred is going to be very well laser focused on restoring those critical assets first. That's going to be very important to minimize response and recovery costs, because the more quickly you're back up to full operating capacity, the better the business is. And then, of course, the other component of recovery is verification. So, like I mentioned earlier, whenever there's an incident, what we like to do is open a bridge and has all of the stakeholders involved, including the security teams, including the technology teams, and also including the leaders of the business organizations that are impacted as perhaps users of your IT infrastructure. Those people are the ones that are going to be doing the testing and certification that the system is operational, because ultimately the systems, the IT systems that we support are really there to support business operations, and the business operations people are the guys that have to say, yes, this is functional, or no, this is still running in a degraded state. And that's an important step of the process that should be codified in your incident response plan. After the technology and security teams have verified that they've eradicated an incident, there should be a step in there specifically for, like, you could call it almost user acceptance testing, right? So that the user base, the stakeholders that are involved in that particular asset, that particular process, have verified that it's back up and functional, and that the incident has been recovered from. This is kind of putting the bookend on the incident response process with one caveat, and we still haven't done lessons learned. And lessons learned is extremely important. In fact, I'd say this is perhaps the most important. If not, it's immediately following preparation in terms of overall importance. Because lessons learned is where we're going to be able to take a look back and say, we did this part really well, but we suffered because we didn't do as well at this other aspect of it. And that's going to enable the leadership team to verify that they've got resources allocated in the right manner. Perhaps they're, the IT security budget's very focused on things like, prevention or containment, but it lacks some of the identification capabilities, where the investigation didn't happen as quickly as it should have, and as a result, the recovery process took a very, very long time. Or because we didn't have adequate business continuity operations planning, we weren't able to recover to full operating capacity for several days, and that cost the company, $1 million or something along those lines. So the lessons learned is where you're going to identify those big gaps. And be able to put a plan together to fix them and to fill those gaps. And that's really the core message of this. I mean, incident response, what we're really talking about here is that we know we're not going to be perfect, but we want to continuously improve. And lessons learned is a mechanism of continuous improvement. And provided you're doing this for every incident that you come across, and you're actually implementing the stuff that comes out of a lessons learned exercise, then each time something happens, you're going to get better than you were previously. And at the end of the day, isn't that the goal? If we know we're not going to be perfect, but we can be better tomorrow than we were today, then that's pretty much the best that we can hope for. So things that I always ask when we're looking at lessons learned are, did we prepare sufficiently? Did we have the right incident response plan? Did we practice it enough? Did people know what they needed to do? Did we communicate clearly enough? Were the right people involved at the various stages of this to ensure that we were able to recover fast enough? Were we able to detect the incident quickly enough? And a lot of times the answer to that one's going to be no. In fact, the answer to many of these may be no, but again, if the focus is not so much on finger pointing, but more on pointing forward, how do we move forward from here, then it's a useful exercise. Because again, what we're really trying to do is answer the question, how can we prevent this from happening again? Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in a continuous loop where the same things may be occurring over and over again, but if you're not fixing the root cause, then you're going to leave yourself in a risky sort of environment. So it's really important to do lessons learned, and I would say that lessons learned isn't just a concept that's unique to incident response, but in reality, I mean, every business process that we use or that anyone uses should go through a lessons learned exercise every now and again, at least, to ensure that we're focused on continuous improvement and getting better each time we run through that cycle. And I think that's actually also how an MSSP can help. Because simply, you don't have to do this alone. A lot of the stuff that we talked about today may be very foreign to you. Even if you're, a highly seasoned technical person, incident response can be a very, a complex subject. And because it's so complex, because there's so many moving parts, because there's so much different kinds of data that need to be brought together, and because there's so many people that could potentially be affected by it, it can be a tricky thing to navigate through an incident response sort of engagement. And if an organization is attempting to do this themselves without any outside support, what you might find is that if you did need to move into prosecution, you might not be able to because the correct and steps for protecting evidence, chain of custody may not have been followed, or the indicators that were on a hard drive got overwritten because it didn't get shut down fast enough because we didn't really know we had to. There's a myriad of different ways that incident response can go belly up. And an MSSP that has a lot of experience doing that, you should be leveraging that because it can help make things a lot easier on the client side. You know at the end of the day that at some point in time, somebody's going to accidentally click the wrong link in an email, and it's going to result in a successful phish that drops an exploit kit on a laptop in your environment. If you're not able to very, very quickly perform the entire steps or the life cycle that I just talked about, then you're going to wind up in a situation where that malware might turn into a data breach, and that is a much more serious sort of incident. If you actually have had a data breach and you don't have a formal incident response process or an incident response team that's capable of doing the forensic analysis and things like that, then that's going to be very costly and very difficult to recover from on your side. You want to try to stop it before it becomes a data breach, but if you've actually experienced a data breach, then you certainly are going to have to move into the client notification aspect of it, and a seasoned partner that deals with incident response on a regular basis can make that much, much easier for you guys. So with that said, that's the end of the content that I prepared today. So we're going to open it up for questions at this point, and let's see what sort of questions we have here. Okay, so let's see. You mentioned testing. How often should my IR plan be tested? That's a good question. So your incident response plan is something that certain regulations are going to require you to test at least annually. My personal opinion on that is that annually might not be sufficient. If your technology environment is experiencing any kind of change, any significant change, or not even just the technology environment, but your user base, or if new people are introduced to the incident response process that have a role or some responsibility into it, you should test it. Because if, let's say you hire somebody new and they've got a critical piece of incident response around containment, for instance, if they don't know what their roles and responsibilities are from an incident response standpoint, then they're going to be much less effective and much less able to actually assist with the incident response lifecycle. So I would suggest that while annually may be the minimum required by your particular regulatory environment, I would shoot to do it more frequently than that. We usually coach to at least quarterly, or in the event of a significant change in the environment. So that's what I would recommend there. I have another question, who should be involved in creating the incident response plan? So the incident response plan should be developed in a collaborative sort of environment amongst the stakeholders for your business. It's going to certainly include your security operations team. They should probably be leading the effort, I guess with oversight from the senior leadership of the organization. And then any business area stakeholder or director level sort of person across the various different roles within your organization should probably be involved in that too. Anybody that really is responsible for a body of work that utilizes the information systems that you're tasked with protecting. So, for instance, you may have your accounting director included in that because your accounting systems might be affected by incident response, and you've got to be able to ensure that you've got the right recovery mechanisms in place there. Certainly your IT staff needs to be included in the IRP as well. But you also need to remember that since security is a bigger thing than just technology, it needs to be not just the security and the IT people. It should go further than that, including leadership and including, again, those key stakeholders from various different organizations. Okay, another question. If we were to hire TruShield, how much incident response would you handle, and how involved would we still need to be? Okay, there's a couple ways to answer that. So if we were responsible for incident response for your organization, we engage in a couple of different ways. First off, we do retainer-based incident response where our clients engage us for a certain number of incident response hours over the course of a year, and then we're deployed in the event of an incident. And effectively, we would drop people on site within 24 hours to go and handle the incident response aspect of it within the confines of the retainer agreement that we've got with the client. So usually that's going to simply be bound by the number of hours that we're allowed to dedicate to any single incident. So that would take the vast majority of it off of the client's plate, because we're going to be doing all the evidence collection and all of the forensic investigation, analysis, and root cause analysis and stuff like that. But what you probably are still going to have to do is the containment. Because the containment aspect of it, and also, detection and containment, because detection is, you're going to obviously need to be able to say an incident has occurred, we need to engage our IR company, and the containment aspect of it, again, is going to a lot of times be things like locking down your network, and that's going to fall more so on your side than our side when you engage us in a retainer sort of format. Additionally, our managed security customers, where we're doing 24/7 monitoring and incident response for them, there's essentially unlimited incident response that's included in that. And in those cases, we may be, since we're a managed security provider, we may be responsible for managing your firewalls or managing servers or patching and things like that, in which case the vast majority of that incident response process would be handled by us with information and stakeholder communication with you. So it can work in a couple different ways depending upon how you engage us. And there are a lot of ways that we can help above and beyond incident response as well. When you're devising your incident response strategy and talking through the containment strategy, the detection identification strategy, we can help with all that stuff as well. So in reality, basically every component of the incident response process that we talk through, we can certainly help you define what that means to your organization or operate it for you, depending upon what level of service it is you're looking for. Do you have any more questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. So with that said, I would like to thank all of the attendees for listening today and bringing your interesting questions to the table. Again, I'm going to invite you to please reach out to us either on our website or by phone there. One thing I will say specifically with respect to incident response is that our organization does a lot of research around threats and we produce advisories with respect to what threats we're seeing in the wild at any one time. So that stuff's available on our website in our resource center. And if you're looking for a way to enhance your security program for free, those threat advisories are a great way to do that, because we'll give you indicators that you can run through your own systems and say, do we have any incidents of this, this particular piece of ransomware, which we see a ton of. So make sure you take a look at that stuff when you have the time. And again, thank you for joining us today.